Hello. Welcome back to the One Room at a Time podcast. I am your host, Atticus LeBlanc, and I'm the founder and CEO of PadSplit. We are the country's largest co-living marketplace. I've worked in the affordable housing sector for over 20 years now. Property owner, developer, now an entrepreneur. Excited that you are tuning in with us today. If you'd like and you enjoy what you hear, please do us a favor, subscribe, leave a review, suggest a guest that we can have on the show. We're going to talk about housing, policy leaders, and just discuss some of the challenges, opportunities that our country is facing in terms of this growing housing crisis, where we can have spirited debates and focus on practical solutions to the major issue. Today, we have a very special guest who also happens to be my friend, Eric Kronberg. Eric is known for balancing and blending the often competing needs of urban design, architecture, and development. As a principal at Kronberg Urbanists+Architects, he leads a team of practitioners who navigate regulations and zoning to help create better places and spaces for all. More importantly, he is, like myself, a charger of windmills. Maybe Eric is better known for just throwing Molotov cocktails at them and taking on all sorts of challenges, speaking power to truth. So really excited to have Eric on the show today. Eric, what did I miss from your background that you want to share other than the controversy?
Man, been doing this a long time, and you get, I think, equally parts more cynical and hopeful, or you have to have more hope. But I feel like we've been working on urban infill, but really attainable housing deeply for the past 15 years. And I feel like we're finally getting to the place where we're really understanding how the systems work, or a better understanding of how the systems work and how you can use that to try to get to better outcomes. So I feel like we're finally, this is how the financial sector starts to interplay. Really understand zoning. This is how all these regulations cause harm. And so I feel like we're finally making some sense of the mess.
Yeah.
So.
Well, tell us how you personally have made sense of the mess, and just maybe like, I know we share an affinity for New Orleans as my hometown and one of your adopteds. But yeah, how did you get here? How did you become so passionate about housing and what fuels you?
I mean, I'm going to start with New Orleans because I got to go down a few weeks ago. Habitat for Humanity New Orleans was having a big convening, more of as a remembrance or observation of 20 years of post-Katrina and all the work they've been doing. So it was great to be with the folks from Habitat for New Orleans, but they also had practitioners from the country. And a lot of what we talk about and present on, I showed to them, is they asked me to talk about what's innovative, that's best practices for New Orleans. And I'm like, well, actually, most of what we're doing is trying to disassemble and reassemble New Orleans for other places. And it's really that realization. We hit it on about 5 or 6 years ago, but it's looking at all the things from lot sizes to building types to urban design to all these different things to figure out how to make great places that are attainable, right? Because attainable is our grounding point. And when you look at so much of New Orleans that was so land constrained, they were so hyper efficient. We look at like 7th Ward and some of these, not St. Charles, but some of these other districts, they have been amazingly innovative with how they house people, and it's cute and wonderful and it works. And we spent a lot of time thinking about how can we take similar approaches of small housing, small lots, great walkability, and bring it to other places. And it's not just what could the zoning need to be, but what are the housing units themselves? Like, what are all the pieces of the system that would make this work? So so much of our work has been taking New Orleans, disassembling it. And for the folks at Habitat, we did a range of scattered site, historic tax credit, low-income housing tax credit, infill projects with a good friend of client over the years from like post-Katrina 2011 to 2015, 16. And so we took a few of those lots and we made little playing cards out of them. We said, hey, that little duplex over there that has 2 one-bedroom units, what's its stats? And by stats, we're like, how many units per acre is that? What is its tax value per acre? Pulling some of the great stuff from Urban 3 and other places. And we've got this one little duplex on North Galvez. It's just a cute little thing, but it's 68 units per acre.
Wow.
Because the lot size is like 1,200 square feet, right? Like the lot size is so fractional that it's super dense. Oh, and by the way, it's worth about $5.8 million per acre. And it has a depressed assessed value because it's low-income housing tax credit, rent reduced. But if you build really small housing on really small lots, you get these outsized returns. And so we compared it to like a brand new, really nice, standard apartment complex in Greenville, South Carolina. And, that thing was worth like 2.8 million per acre, had like 28, 30 units per acre, maybe. Like this little duplex was like almost double the value for the city.
Yeah.
And so it's like, what do you measure? How do we look at what's meaningful? And how do we do this in a way that's accessible for folks? So like, that's my, like, how do we take New Orleans every day? Think about it. What are the DNA of it? How do we bring it to other places?
So for folks who are learning here, Eric, that don't know like typical densities, and I know you are the zoning whisperer, and so forgive us, audience, if we get too technical here, but bring it up just to 30,000 feet, Eric. Like typical single family zoning density versus these duplexes that are 68 units per acre, even as a probably two-story product or
these were one story. They were just really one-story product, really small. It's so beautiful, so crazy.
Yeah. So like typical density in the U.S. Of course, we are both here in Atlanta. What would you typically see, and why does it matter?
Sure. So much of try to make this not a super long answer, but so much of the housing crisis is how much land is required to provide one unit of housing, right? That is a basic component of zoning on the single family side of things. And in the South, and I picked the South by, it's more of like, when was your town or parts of your town developed? And so much of America, there was a boom from the late 1890s to 1929, right? Where coming out of the Great Depression of the 1890s through the Roaring 20s until the Great Depression, so many cities were platted and things were happening. And most of those neighborhoods had a typical lot size of 50 by 150. That's your standard lot. So much of like in town Atlanta has that, but we work across the country. Like, we're in Tulsa right now, totally typical lot size. And that's 7,500 square feet, right? And so an acre is 43,560 square feet. So you divide 7,500 by 43,560. And I don't know that number off the top of my head, but if you have one house per lot, I mean, I'm going to actually pull up my spreadsheet just because I literally keep a spreadsheet because I'm always running acres all the time to not misquote you on this. But like, if you have one house per that, like, what do you get to? And I'm typing in 560 to do this, to do the math. And I want to say divided by that, that's 0.17 acres. So if you only have one house on that lot, you're dividing by a decimal or a fraction, that's 5.8 units per acre. So one house on a standard lot, you can get about 5 of those lots, and that would make up an acre, and you'd have 5 houses. And so when we talk about density, we talk about how do we measure what's a fair yardstick. Units per acre is a good yardstick, even though you don't have an acre of land. If you did have an acre of land, how many units would result in this, right? That is the way to think about it. And so standard 1920s is that. But there's a lot of towns that have really suburban zoning that they have, a half acre minimum lot size. That means you can only have 2 units of housing per acre, right? Or a 1 acre minimum lot size is easy. That's 1 house per acre. That's a lot of land. And so we have learned so much from my friend Joe Medicosi. When you talk about it's, all these houses have frontage, right? They have roads, they have pipes, or sidewalks, curb and gutter. All that infrastructure is really expensive. And the more frontage you have, the more public good you're consuming of that public frontage that has to be maintained and repaired. That takes a lot of resources. And single family homes never generate the tax basis to cover the replacement cost of their infrastructure because it runs out at about 50 to 70 years, depending on how well it was built in the first place. And so we spend a lot of time explaining that if you look at when the boom of American suburbia, right, from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and you do really basic math and you add 50 to 70 years to when these neighborhoods were built out, you realize most of these neighborhoods are at replacement time, right? In terms of the pipes and the sidewalks, and there's been no capital reserve put in place to replace everything. No city squirrels away like 10% of the property taxes for infrastructure replacements 40 years from now, right? Like we don't have that wealth to save to do this. So part of what we talk about when we talk about like housing and attainability, we tackle it from all sides. We think about infrastructure for cities. We talk about city budgets. We talk about how those things come together or don't so you can hit the fiscal conservatives. You talk about attainability for housing, you hit it from the other side. But in New Orleans, in terms of small, dense housing with narrow lots with narrow frontage, you're getting like these maximum returns of units in a way that is really powerful for not a lot of frontage and not a lot of land. And that is a really effective way to house people attainably and have a great city.
So when you say attainably, really what we're talking about is just the shortage of affordable or attainable housing options. And so in a nutshell, that New Orleans density model at 68 units per acre can just house more people for less money in a sustainable way compared to the traditional quarter acre
man.
lot. Is that the gist?
So what I love is that like the questions were sent to think about things, but like we're just going to keep going deep on other really cool stuff. So this is awesome. So one of the other things we've learned a lot, and I always want to give shout outs to where the information started from. So become a huge fan of Shane Phillip and UCLA Housing Voice. Their podcast on housing policy, they've been doing amazing work. So that's also another great podcast to look at. But they had Anthony Orlando and Michael Erickson on. This was fall of 24. And these two, they're academics, but they ran this really cool analysis of the cost per square foot per story of multifamily housing. And so basically saying that it's not a linear progression from 2 stories to 3 stories to 4 stories. There's these stair-stepping components based on building code regulations and everything else. I talked to them, understood their methodology, and was able to pull their data from 2018 to 2024, looking at it across not just per square foot, but cost per unit. The fundamental point that we see and we're seeing in the marketplace is this traditional double-loaded corridor multifamily building. It's just an expensive building to build, and the cost per unit means that there is no way to deliver that in an attainable rent fashion without subsidy. And that's the nature of the building itself, right? Just flat out, it's an expensive way to build. Why New Orleans matters as a comparative is that those multifamily buildings for non-experts are under the International Building Code, which is a very complex way to regulate and build housing. Single family homes, duplexes, and townhomes fall under a separate building code, the International Residential Code. That has been kept simple, honestly, by lobbying by the National Home Building Association for the past 30 years to make sure that doesn't get out of control from a code standpoint. And so it's a much more right-sized set of regulations, which means that it's a lot more cost-effective to build housing under those guidelines.
Got it. So it's cheaper to build under IRC than under the
by orders of magnitude, right? And all the stuff in New Orleans where it's small lot, it may be a duplex or like some small singles, that's all IRC construction. So it's easy to build, it's simple, it's safe to get out of because it's not a big unit, you're right to the street. Mm-hmm. So it checks all the boxes. But what we see people miss all the time, particularly in the affordable housing space, like they've just been swimming in the water. Well, you just do the apartment complex.
Yeah.
And it's going to cost a lot of money. And then you got to get subsidy. And then the compliance adds more costs and stacks and stacks and stacks. Well, that's a trap. And once you're in that trap, it's really hard to get out of.
Sure.
We spend so much time explaining that small format residential building can be really dense, really wonderful, and way more cost effective, which means they're either naturally attainable, right? Just because it costs less to do this, and or if you've got access to a little bit of subsidy, ideally non-federal subsidy, you can make it even more attainable without triggering a whole bunch of compliance requirements.
Got it.
Which drives up cost. So it's how does the building code drive up cost? How does subdivision ordinances, how does zoning, and then the financial sector and federal regulations, how do all these things come together to make a big hairy mess, which is the American housing system?
Sure.
And what else do you do?
Yeah, so basically the gist is you can build with this residential code 1 or 2 stories, maybe 3. But when people think density, a lot of folks automatically think, oh, well, New York City or Manhattan or Miami. But the reality is that you look at a place like New Orleans, or we were talking about Europe before the podcast started, you can have these dense areas that are really just small scale buildings, but on much smaller footprints. And those are more cost effective, not just for the builder, but also what you're saying, it sounds like, is for the city or county or what have you in terms of return on investment from the infrastructure. Is that the gist?
That is absolutely the gist. There's one huge caveat to put into all this is that the biggest thing that destroys the value or like the whole system falls apart is how much land, honestly, you want to scavenge from providing housing for humans and require to be housing for cars, right? That little New Orleans duplex in Galvez at 68 units per acre, that site is almost completely covered by the one-story duplex, right? There is no parking, driveway, anything, right? There's 2 small yards, but there's no car storage in that. So that gets in, you have to think about the block structure, the walkability, access to corner stores and goods and services, maybe catching a bus to work, and honestly, just a lot of on-street parking. But the transportation systems are critical to allow the housing outcomes, but that doesn't mean you need a train. It just means that you need a safe place to bike or walk, and or some people that have cars can park on the street. And, I think one of the things ethos in New Orleans is, we've got friends that live in really nice houses in Uptown that park on the street and would never expect to have a driveway.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and that's the other side of New Orleans is it's as much the transportation expectations that it was a city built before cars and, with ways to get people around that unlocks all the land value.
Sure. Yeah.
And if you don't have that and that doesn't mean trains, it just means good small blocks.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's funny. Like quick side note. I've heard this many times over. I'm sure you have as well. But when we've done pad splits in single family neighborhoods, one of the critiques we hear or see on social media often from the neighbors is we don't park on the street in this neighborhood, right? And there are too many cars parked on the street. And to your point, it's like, oh, well, I guess we should reserve a house for the car as well, because
Yes.
God forbid that car get wet or anything else. It's pretty wild.
Yeah. And so we have to talk to city officials and community activists that, parking spaces are expensive, and they're not just expensive from like the asphalt and the curb and the gutter and those kinds of things. They often trigger stormwater requirements for the runoff, so that compounds all the costs there. But there's also this deep opportunity cost of what you're not able to build on the private land because you've scavenged it for vehicle housing instead of humans. And so I have this, it's really loose backwards math that every parking space, like, it's probably worth about 20 grand. Like, just the actual building space is like 7 grand, but then how do you measure opportunity costs, all these things? But 20 grand is kind of a nice round number. And that used to be pre-COVID about the cheapest space you could do in a deck, right? 20, 25,000. So it kind of tracks reasonably. But if you can do like 5 or 6 on-street parking spaces instead of like that parking on a site, you're generating tremendous economic value for your place. Right? That every one of those parking spaces is a revenue generator for your town. And so if you have all these overly wide streets that you paid for with all this expensive asphalt and stormwater mitigation and stuff, and you're not using it to generate revenue on the private sector on the land side, man, you're missing an opportunity for your town.
Yeah. I just did some quick math as well. It's like, if you assume $200 per square foot new construction building cost under IRC, that's $24,000 for a bedroom. So, like, you literally have a choice. You can house a car, or you can house a bedroom, or you can house a person.
Yeah, same price, same value.
Yeah,
which is, I don't think we have a vehicle housing crisis in America. I think we have a human housing crisis in America. Focus on the real problem.
Yeah, actually, that'd be a great campaign though. Is if somebody did a satire around like house our cars. That I would love to see that. That's something. I mean, you're great at visuals, Eric. Like you gotta turn that out.
Well, we've got a great little sequence. Another just way to talk about this stuff is when you think about how we regulate our cities, and Atlanta's the example, but we're not the only city by any means. So many cities in the 70s through like federally funded white flight, were disinvested, were hollowed out. And so in the mid 70s, early 80s, a lot of cities like Atlanta adopted a new zoning ordinance. But by and large, they were just adopting what was the conventional suburban zoning at the time, because city leaders were like, oh, look, so suburbia is booming. Maybe we should copy their regulations. And so much of this is there's so many things, but parking reform is like the big, easy one to point to. It's like, okay, you're downtown. If you want to be able to get a new building from that building, you've got to buy the next 2 lots over and tear those buildings down and make them a parking lot. I mean, that was legally mandated, and it's still legally mandated for most places in America. And like, we wonder why our downtowns suck and why they're all parking lots. Like, those are the laws we put on the books.
Yeah,
that's
great.
And
so all right. So to recap, small lots, residential building code, smaller spaces equals better return on investment, more affordability. And that's particularly important now because we are seeing there's unlikely to be more subsidies. Is that an accurate assessment?
That's accurate. And then the other thing we always tell people is we say Google your town, look for a Sanborn map, library, which are the old fire insurance maps, and you can usually find them through Library of Congress, and try to find a Sanborn map of your town from the 20s. It'll show you all the land that was built out at that time. So it's a really easy cheat code to figure out what neighborhoods have the urbanism that geeky urbanists like us care about, but you don't have to understand urbanism. You just have to understand, hey, these 1920s neighborhoods are probably by like main streets or neighborhood centers. It's a lot easier to do what I'm talking about in those places. In 1970s suburbia, this stuff is like, it's oil and water out there.
Yeah.
But these other places, this is how it was done.
So this is, I mean, a lot of this is just basic math and basic history, right? I mean, New Orleans is an old town. As we talk about Paris or Rome or Venice, all these areas that are not necessarily dense in the way that people think about mid-rise, high-rise, but really dense from a human housing perspective and sustainable, clearly over centuries. So, I mean, how do you, like, it seems like this should be obvious for a lot of policymakers, and yet it seems to not be in practice. And so, like, what are the obstacles that you see when you have these conversations on a local level, either with a neighborhood group or city policymakers? I mean, are more people coming around to these ideas, or is there still just a lot of pushback or a lack of willingness to kind of do the math or see the history?
So part of it's doing the math, the other part's showing the math, but there's a longer answer to that question that I think we should save as a teaser for the next episode.
Well, yeah, great segue. So, yeah, great start to our convo, and I think probably appropriate to pause here. We'll do a two-part session here, since if it's not already apparent, Eric is a wealth of knowledge, and we will pick things back up in part 2, where we'll dive even deeper into the discussion about housing policy and how do you fix this. So for our listeners that are catching the end of part 1 here, you can learn more about Eric and his firm at Kronberg, Kronberg, UA.com. And you can also look for him on LinkedIn, where he often comments about housing policy. And do not forget to join us for part 2 of this episode on One Room at a Time.